Right. Are you are you are you seeing those okay? Give me a thumb, Alex. Yes, good. Lovely. So yes, thank you very much for the invitation. My name's Jeni Tennison and I lead an organisation called Connected by Data, which I will talk about in a minute. And yeah, I'm going to talk a bit about community power in AI, in part trying to build on some of the stuff that I know that you've already been talking about, in particular with CIP, so Collective Intelligence Project, a couple of weeks ago as well. So just to give you a kind of where my angle is going to be, just to talk about that. Thinking about what public AI means, I think from what I can see, and you guys will correct me, there are a number of different ways of thinking about that. So are we meaning AI that is publicly available, that's created by the public, that's publicly owned or publicly funded, or that's oriented towards public good or public benefit? Or are we talking about AI that is governed by the public, where the public have some control over it? And for this conversation, I'm going to be focusing on that last one. So what is the role of the public in governing data and AI systems? And that's really the focus of my organisation, Connected by Data. We exist to give communities a powerful say in decisions about data and AI. And that's building on a kind of body of work that really shows that the people that need to be involved in decisions about data and AI, if we want to get to fairness and equity and trustworthiness and all of those kinds of things, the people who are affected by AI need to be involved in the decisions about it. And that's because the way that AI works by default is that power in the world, so existing resources and access and capabilities in the world, lead to power over data and AI, and the power over data and AI, over what data gets collected, what it looks like, how it gets used, then can lead to power in the world as well, making automated decisions about people, nudging people in particular directions, and so on. And so we are currently in this kind of spiral where those who have power in the world have power over data and AI, who get then more power in the world, more power over data and AI, and so on. If we want the public to be involved in AI, we need to break that cycle somewhere. And the bit that we're interested in at Connected by Data is how we insert the power over data and AI, insert the public into that power equation. So that this is all factored on the fact that it really matters who decides what and how data is collected, which values get optimized for in AI systems, how we even define things like fairness, what problems with AI actually get addressed, what kind of AI development is prioritized to start with. All of these questions are design choices that we make as a society, as individuals, as organizations. And who decides the answers to those questions will determine like how they are answered, and therefore what kind of world gets built, what kind of AI gets built, and the kind of impact that it has on our communities and societies and on our environment and so on. So we really want to see the who there being expanded out from the kind of usual suspects in order to give the public more control over that. So I'm going to go through 4 different kinds of approaches for thinking about public involvement in those in making those kinds of decisions. A thread of work that's been done around community stewardship of assets like data and AI assets. A thread of work that's been done around public participation and how the public can get involved in those kinds of conversations and decision making. But then on the other side, and in a more slightly less invited space, I would say, pieces around how we think about collective data rights, what kind of rights we need as communities and societies over data, and around collective action. So what does power actually mean in practice? How do we activate that in order to change the way in which the world is working? So community stewardship is probably where I started with this work, back when I was at the Open Data Institute, where we had a big focus for a while on data institutions and the idea of the importance of the organizations that hold data, that steward it, that make it available for others to build on and work with. And we looked at data institutions that were kind of existing and old, so things like statistics organizations, as well as ones that were kind of coming up and new. So for example, things like the data exchanges, where you have lots of individuals who are contributing data into a particular organization that can then analyze them and provide insights over the top of them. So we're really interested in how these kinds of organizations that were to do with sharing of data were working. One of the models I particularly point to around those kind of data institution pieces of work are data cooperatives. And I'd really point to Open Data Manchester's work around data cooperatives, where they have been exploring different kinds of things that make a data cooperative work well. So where you have co-ownership of the institution and the decisions that get made by the institution about the collection and stewardship of data. This particular example, looking at data cooperatives for small energy companies. But I would also point to work that's been done in community, in particular, some of the work that was done by Black Thrive in the UK, looking at how communities can steward and host their own data, which might be a combination of lived experience data that they generate or data that they collect, and data that they're getting from other kinds of sources, maybe some more official sources, that they then collaboratively reanalyze and reinterpret in ways that help them to form community and form action within those communities. So there's this thread here of work that is really focused on bringing how we can collectively and collaboratively steward data sets, that also applies to, I think, things like AI models and elsewhere. But the thing with those kinds of models is that there's often an alternative source for data when it comes to the creation of AI systems. And so you can't completely control what AI gets built just by controlling some of the data that's available, because there's always other sources that people can go to. So what we've been focusing on more recently is the idea of public participation in a whole load of those decisions, even where the public isn't the owner of those data sets or the AI that's being built. So how do we bring public into those decision-making processes? Work that I point to here is work done by the Ada Lovelace Institute on participatory data stewardship and participatory data more generally, which talks about the different kinds of ways in which the public can be involved, from just informing the public through to consulting with them, listening to them, involving them in decisions, actually collaborating on a more or less equal footing, and then empowering the public. So different kind of levels on what's often called a participation ladder that gives more and more power to the individuals and organizations that are affected by data. And this that kind of work is part of what's being termed the participatory turn in AI design. It's an idea of involving the public that is coming more and more to the fore in the kinds of ways in which AI is being developed. This paper by Fernando Delgado and others is a really good kind of overview of the different kinds of ways in which that's happening, at least reflected in the academic literature. And one of the things that's useful about it is that it breaks down the kinds of examples that there are around involving the public in the design of AI systems, from the point of view of the goal of the participation, the scope of the participation, the form of the participation. So what does it actually look like as people are getting involved? But also on that scale, that kind of similar kind of ladder as I showed in the last slide, of through from consultation through to the members, the public who's being consulted, so the people who are being affected by the technology, whether they actually own that's the goal, or own the scope, or own the form of participation. How much real power do they have as they're being involved in this system design? And the result of the survey, as you can kind of see here from the numbers, is that often in the literature, the forms of participation that we're talking about are actually very low down on the scale of actual empowerment of the people who are being affected by data and AI systems. So they're very frequently called in to do some user testing to kind of just check on whether the user interfaces are working okay, whether and they're very rarely actually involved in the more meaningful decisions about, for example, the system scope or the purpose of the system. So that's a really good paper to have a look at in terms of the where participatory design is in AI at the moment. So just checking the chat, which is now really distracting. So what I think is kind of useful here is, from our own experience, is to really break down the kinds of participation that we're talking about into different types. So getting people involved in understanding what their experience is and what they prefer, that kind of user research is one aspect of getting public involvement. But there's also techniques of like market research and aspects of market research. So you often find participation and deliberation being used actually to help to refine messages to the market or to refine engagement. There's the kind of collective intelligence approach which you heard about a couple of weeks ago, where the participation is focused on pulling up, generating data or inputs into AI systems that can then be used in order to fine tune them or to get build in values to those systems. The more powerful side of public involvement comes when we have deliberative approaches. So that's where you get people in a room, you provide them with evidence, pros and cons of different kinds of approaches to go forward with, and they come out with recommendations having thought about it and talked to each other about it quite a lot. And the real power, I think, comes from where you actually get members of the public, members of affected communities actually into your governance structures. So they are members of independent boards that have veto power over exactly what happens within data and AI systems, for example. So all of these are ways of involving the public and getting understanding what the public think and feel around data and AI systems, but some of them are more powerful than others. Just to give you a couple of pointers for things that we've been doing. So we have been working with in the public sector and building a community of practice within within the UK public sector of people who are interested in this kind of public engagement around data and AI. And they are meet on every couple of months to share kind of use cases and experiences from their work and what they are doing. Another thing I'll point to is something that we published a couple of weeks ago, which is a paper about global citizen deliberation on AI. If you're going to have like big global governance structures around AI, what is the role of the public within that governance? How do we get public voice into those conversations in the same way as we have public voice in conversations about climate change, for example? So that was about public participation. Another aspect of giving public power over data and AI systems is actually to give people and communities rights over data and AI. And a lot of the work that has been done, in particular on collective data rights, has been inspired by work around Indigenous people's rights in data. This pointer is to the Global Indigenous Data Alliance, and they talk about two different sets of data rights that are really important for Indigenous peoples. One that is around enabling them to use data for their own governance, so enabling them to access the data that other people have so that they can better kind of inform their own decision making as a people. But also they want governance of data about aspects of their lives, their land, their language, and so on, that is theirs as a people, and sovereignty over that, so that they have a bunch of rights that are about being able to control access to and use of data that arises from them as a people. And in work that I've been doing, been looking at what those collective data rights might look like. So this isn't just about individuals having data rights. This is about how, as a community, you might have rights, say, in a local community over the way in which your local government is using data. And they break down into three kinds of sets. There are the rights that you need ex ante before even systems get built, to really direct and shape and assess the kind of ideas for where data and AI systems might work. There's a bunch of rights that are needed around transparency and publication of plans and how systems actually work and so on, that form the basis of understanding those systems. And then there's a bunch of rights that are necessary after systems have been deployed in order to change how they work, maybe stop how they work, challenge decision making and those kinds of things. So the different kinds of rights that we need in order to give people an actual powerful say over the way in which AI systems get deployed and developed. Another paper I point out is something done recently by Rachel Caldicott called People Not Code, the Case for a Digital Civil Society Observatory, where she makes the case that civil society has a really powerful role to play in monitoring AI systems and being able to challenge the way in which they work. Civil society is a lot more effective and a lot more powerful. So civil society organizations are more effective and more powerful than a scattered group of individuals. And so building them into the kind of system of governance around data and AI is essential for getting the kind of power change that we need to see. And talking of that, I'll talk finally about collective action as a kind of way of thinking about people power and collective and community power over AI. So collective action is the idea that if we band together, then we are much more powerful than if we are scattered and disparate. And one of the inspirations here is this book by Darren Acemoglu and Simon Johnson from MIT called Power and Progress, which makes the point that whenever there have been big technological shifts in our societies, the way we get to the best outcomes from those is by having countervailing power to the existing power structures, so the existing kind of owners of technology and those that have power in the world. So the argument there is that we need to build that countervailing power in order to get to a better kind of outcome overall. And that really helps to inform and show the importance of work that is being done really by unions and by other kinds of collective organisations, but unions are particularly powerful here. So for example, we've been working with the Trade Union Congress, TUC, here in the UK, looking at the kind of response of unions to the AI revolution, what it is that unions need to be demanding in their workplaces, where they need to draw red lines, where they need to be negotiating, and enabling them to see just a little bit over the hill about what's going to be coming next and where they need to skill themselves up. Other things that we've been doing are also working with grassroots organisations through a 6-month program that we've been running called Catalysing Community Campaigns. So here it's working with really organisations that are, 2 or 3 people trying to get some kind of change to the way in which data systems or AI systems are working. So Careful, for example, is an organisation trying to have economic statistics recognise care as an important part of data in the way in which they work. See Me, Hear Me is an organisation trying to get the voices of Black mothers into raise the voices of Black mothers in the conversations about support for Black women in kind of perinatal and their perinatal health, particularly given the fact that 3.5 times more Black mothers die than white mothers during childbirth. So all of these are like grassroots organisations. We believe quite strongly that arguments about what data and AI need to look like are very contextual, and therefore we need to have organisations that are working really at that kind of grassroots level around particular issues in order to shift the dial. They need to be working in particular workplaces, they need to be working around particular issues so that they can really get into the nuts and bolts of how data and AI work in those situations. So that's our community campaigns kind of work that we've been doing. And then the other thing, and Alex mentioned this, is that we have also been convening a data and AI civil society network in the UK in order to get that more collective action around data and AI policy, to tie up to help with information sharing, to help with coordinated strategies and coalition building, because it is only by acting together that we can actually shift power. And a lot of the kind of work around civil society tends to be quite disparate and can be quite siloed, and therefore loses some of its power and impact because of that. So that's given you a kind of overview of the types of work that I think is interesting for giving communities power over data and AI, but this is all emerging practice. I don't think that anybody would say that there's a one way of doing this that has been recognised and that has been well established. So kinds of questions that are still up for discussion and are up for kind of exploration are what should be the role of the public and civil society in public AI? How would that role be practically realized? What does it actually mean in terms of governance structures or other kinds of activities? And what kinds of policies and ecosystems and other kinds of interventions do we actually need in order to make that kind of thing happen? And I'm hoping that some of the discussion that we can have can touch on some of these kinds of areas. That's it. Thank you very much.
Jeni, thank you so much. We have so we're going to cut to some questions now, and I'm just sort of saying that there's a couple of things I'll say. First is there's a couple of questions that are in the chat which I think are quite technical, so if somebody were able to speak to them, just put their hand up and speak to them, that would be incredibly helpful. And second is just, if you are asking a question, please use the raise hand function and also introduce yourself so we know who you are. I was going to take the privilege of asking the first question, but Josh, you've been very active in the chat, so we're going to pass to you.
Hi folks. Yeah, I'm Josh. I'm a computer scientist at Medagov in Oxford. Maybe I just heard it wrong, but I thought you said somewhere in the kind of earlier middle of the presentation that you were hosting convenings of the public, but the goal was to have them to consult them on data practices and data governance of data that was not their own. That was like, I'm thinking like the private parties, of like publishers. Was that the kind of, was that what you said? Is that what's happening, or I'm just kind of curious?
Okay, I think that the bit that you were referring to there was where I was making the point that if we want to have the public having power over data and AI systems, very frequently that data is not held by organizations that are owned by that set of the public. They're not in a data cooperative, for example, or that data isn't held in a data cooperative or any other kind of data institution that is set up and owned by that kind of set of people. Very frequently, data and AI systems are being built, say, by a public authority, where the people who are affected by the data and AI system have no have very like have no kind of ownership in the governance of that organization. It's owned by the state, or it might be a private sector organization. But to get to a good outcome, our argument is that the people who are affected by that data and AI system still need to have a say in it, right? And we do make a distinction between whether the data that we're talking about that's owned by, held by a private sector or the public sector organization is about those people versus whether it affects, the AI system affects those people. Because you can have a system that is built off of a sample of data from a subset of people, but it can be affecting a whole bunch of other people. And we think the people who are affected need to have a say in the way in which those systems work. So that, I hope that kind of clarifies that, what I was getting at there.
Thanks, Josh. I had a question, Jeni. So what Josh and Brandon and others have been sort of helping us pull together conversations with sovereign AI model builders, people who politically, I think we have a lot of sort of, I don't know, excitement around, or a lot of, they feel like fellow travelers, right? They're building the kinds of AI models with the kinds of applications that are much closer to the applications of technology for a public good that we would like to see. One of the things that they keep bringing up is the challenges that they have around access to data and getting hold of training data that they can use to train these models effectively, while staying within the current regulatory frameworks that applies to that data. Is there a world where the work that Connected by Data lead around about greater public accountability, transparency, participation in that kind of data might make their jobs easier? And if so, what would that look like?
So I think that the types of models that are most appropriate in that kind of scenario, the ones that I was talking about around collective data stewardship. So that's where you get people that you want to get data off to pool the data that they have, but in a way that still gives them a sense of control over it, and where they can make collective decisions around who gets access to it and for what purposes. So so I would be in those cases investigating models like now I'm searching for them. So there are models from particularly in the health and in kind of, I'm searching for the words, where you're monitoring yourself all the time, you bring that data together and you share that data out. So there's lots of places where there are collective pools of data, and some of the links in the presentation to the work at ODI kind of lists out a whole bunch of those kinds of organizations. The challenge is, I think, that those people who are providing data in those kinds of systems also want to see some kind of benefit coming back to them from it. And so, they're not really interested in providing data just because it's kind of going to be fun for somebody to process, right? It needs to demonstrate why it is that's going to be it's going to be useful. But I would be looking at those kinds of collective data collaborative types of models in order to support access to more data in those ways.
Thanks, Jenny. Tim, you noticed something in the chat, which I think sounds like a lot of we've also been hosting some conversations at AI Palace actually, but also since around various approaches to licensing. Tim, maybe you would want to talk about the social license data. Oh, sorry, Dave.
I can try to. I'm on a poor connection, waiting for a bus. But there's work that people like Stefan Verhulst have been working on around does social license data, learning models of social license to operate in the mining extractive sector. So the idea is if you have something like data that's treated as a raw material, as a natural resource, we have to make a decision about who we're allowing to exploit that and where. And that's something that comes from a collective public conversation rather than an individual licensing agreement. So it's got much more to do with mining and minerals licenses, how those get issued, how we have public debate and governance of those, than it is to do with sort of.
Thanks, Tim. I stuck a link to an example, I think, that in the chat. Really helpful. Harriet, hey.
Hello. Hi, everyone. For those who haven't met me, I'm also at Chatham House, but I'm in the international law program, and I do a bit of work on human rights. And Jenny, thank you so much for your talk, because you kind of got me thinking that the focus, when people talk about human rights and AI, they're always talking about privacy, freedom of expression. They don't talk very much about collective rights. And that's partly because we have quite a Western framework on rights and AI. So we think about those individual civil and political rights, which are obviously really important. But in the sort of non-European framework, collective rights, as you mentioned, indigenous rights, for example, are really important. And so, yeah, I just thought that it may be that we neglect, not only are we not thinking, we're focusing overly on individual rights and not enough about other rights, collective rights, but also some rights have been left out. And you mentioned the right to self-determination, which is actually one of the most fundamental rights. I think it's the first one in the UN Charter. And I just think that there's a piece of work there which is around those rights that have been neglected, the right to govern. And I think there's an analogy also with the regulation of social media platforms where everyone bangs on about the right to freedom of expression. And obviously there's an AI angle there because those social media platforms are run by recommender settings, which are themselves AI. And given the kind of like polluted online public square, it just made me think that seeing those again through a collective approach, which is sort of rooted in, a human rights framework, is quite valuable rather than simply focusing on individual rights. So thank you for kind of provoking those thoughts in me, at least.
Yeah, thanks, Harriet. And I think that one of the things that we've been trying to push is that to really recognise the collective impacts of data and AI systems rather than just the individual impacts of them. And there's a very good paper by Natalie Smuha, I think, who looks at individual, collective and societal impacts of data and AI. That really breaks those down. So, for example, at the very societal level, you can look at impacts on democracy, trust in institutions. You can look at, obviously, I think, coming to the fore in the discourse around AI at the moment, you can look at environmental impacts, right? So it's not just the kind of ones that are, as you mentioned, that are very bound in the kind of human rights and individual rights kind of frameworks. We need to also be thinking of these ones that are about the kind of society that we want to build, right, and the kind that we want to have. So one of the things that we've been pushing for is, for example, around impact assessments done early on in the design of AI systems. What are the kinds of things whose impact that we actually need to look at? Because often it will be focusing on privacy impact or maybe human rights impact, but we think it also should be looking at, equality impacts, impacts on democracy, impacts on the environment as part of those kinds of assessments if we're going to really understand the kinds of trade-offs that we have around the deployment of these systems.
Thanks.
Great, thank you, Jenny. That was amazing. I especially liked it because I've been trying to, as we're designing our own public AI white paper, I've been thinking about how to make a picture to describe this, and your slides were fantastic. So I actually made a slide for my question inspired by your slides. So it's a quadrant analysis, so you're going to need to understand. So I'm going to explain the words. So I guess I'm going to use this word, maybe it's the wrong word, about standing. Do people have standing to say something about something that's happening? So if it's like someone is in your house, like you have standing because they're in your house. And then, but like if it's affecting someone else, traditionally, you don't have a standing to talk about it. And so I noticed that, yeah, I'm looking forward to tucking into the thing Tim cited about this data from me, about me, and data that affects me. I think it's fantastic when he does. But I think that's amazing, and I want to think about that more after this. But I just have a question. So here it goes. Here's the matrix. So yeah, basically, I'm wondering, just a simple question. Let's assume that like there's some things happening with AI and data that are high risk and low risk for society, and where people have strong standing to contest it, and where they have poor standing to contest it. And I'm just wondering, in your work, what you're noticing is like really the danger zone there, where they're high risk for society, but people, based on our existing paradigms about how that kind of standing is constructed, which which you guys are sort of exploring all in a fascinating way. What is it? Because yeah, thank you. Very inspiring stuff.
Yeah, so I think that piece around standing, as you described it, there are other words that we kind of might use around that. So there's like standing as in power, like who actually has power here and who doesn't have power. There's kind of standing as in rights, and we just talked about the kinds of different people having different rights, and that our very individualistic, privacy focused rights frameworks actually exclude a bunch of people that might be affected by systems from having rights in those systems. And there's also a thing standing made me think of legitimacy, and that's a very frequent thing that comes up in the kinds of conversations that we have around, in particular, public participation, because a lot of the kind of critique that will come up around public participation is, do the people who are being involved in these decisions actually have legitimacy to make these kinds of decisions? Aren't they just the normal standard people who will be making the most noise? How do we recognize, in particular, when there's collective decision making on behalf of a larger community, right, where you've just got a small group of people that are doing a deliberation, that are making some recommendations on behalf of a whole kind of local community, for example? Does that small group have legitimacy to make those decisions from the perspective of that larger group of people as well? And that's where things like how we do those public participation exercises, how we communicate about them, how we involve other people in them, becomes really, really important, because they have to demonstrate legitimacy, they have to win legitimacy in being able to make those decisions on behalf of that broader group. Yeah, so there's a whole bunch of things there to kind of dig into if you like to.
Jenny, just to pick up on Brandon's question there, can we touch on the danger zone? So even if it is legitimacy or capacity or awareness or whatever, these sort of currently high risk, low standing, low capacity, low power spaces, are there any that jump out to your mind that you're particularly concerned about?
I mean, the classic and very obvious things are that we know that data and AI systems tend to have really poor effects for people who are already marginalized. So, I hear a lot from people who say that the first set of people that you should go to talk about how your system is working is Black women, because they're doubly kind of marginalized in these kinds of conversations. but I would also throw, you know, it really depends on the system and what the system is doing. But I would throw in things like neurodiversity, trans people, people from the global south. Like there's a whole bunch of people who do not have power in our conversations around data and AI, and who are often, because they're on the margins, they're often not well served by data and AI systems, which tend to serve best the majority. So those are the people, like if you don't go for a kind of broad representative kind of sample, and even if you do, the ones to really focus on are the people who are most marginalized, because they're the ones that are going to be worst affected.
Thanks, Jenny. I think the volume of spicy, scurrilous questions is now just too high so we're going to have to stop recording so we can move to that. We're going to run for another probably 20 minutes or so, so we'll finish at 5 past the hour. Stop recording.